Kieran wiped the sweat from his brow and leaned against his rusted old truck, watching the sun sink behind the horizon. His hands ached from the long day at the auto shop, and all he wanted was to get home, eat whatever leftovers were in the fridge, and tuck his daughter into bed. But fate had other plans. A sleek black sports car was parked on the side of the road just ahead, its hazard lights blinking in distress. Normally, he would have ignored at people in cars like that never needed help from men like him, but something made him slow down. Maybe it was the way the driver, a woman, stood beside it, arms crossed, looking completely out of place on the dusty roadside. With a sigh, Kieran pulled over and stepped out. "You need some help." The woman turned, and for a second, Kieran forgot how to breathe. She was stunning, long, dark hair falling in soft waves, deep brown eyes filled with frustration. She was dressed in an elegant blouse and tailored pants, the kind of outfit that probably cost more than his rent. "Flat tire," she said, exasperated. "And I have absolutely no idea what to do about it." Kieran glanced at the tire and let out a low whistle. "Yeah, that's not going anywhere." He crouched down, inspecting the damage. "Good news is I can fix it. Bad news, your spare is useless," she groaned. "Of course it is. This day just keeps getting better." Kieran chuckled. "You got anywhere to be?" She hesitated. "I was heading back into the city, but at this point, I'd settle for a place that serves decent coffee." "Well," Kieran said, standing and dusting off his hands, "I can grab a spare from my shop, but it'll take a bit. I could give you a ride somewhere while you wait." She eyed him carefully, as if trying to decide whether he was trustworthy. Then she nodded. "All right, I appreciate the help." "Kieran," he said, offering his hand. She took it, her grip surprisingly firm. "Francesca." "Nice to meet you, Francesca. Hop in." She hesitated before climbing into his truck, clearly not used to something so worn down. Kieran tried not to take it personally as he started the engine. "So, what brought you out this way?" he asked. "Business meeting," she said vaguely, staring out the window. "And you?" "Work at the auto shop a few miles back. Got a little girl at home, so I do what I can to keep things steady." Francesca turned to him, interest sparking in her eyes. "You have a daughter?" "Yeah, Lily, she's 6, smartest kid I know." His face softened. "She's my whole world." Francesca smiled, and for the first time since he'd seen her, she looked completely at ease. "She's lucky to have you." Kieran wasn't sure why her words affected him so much, but something about the way she said it made his chest tighten. By the time they reached a small diner on the outskirts of town, the tension between them had shifted into something else, something neither of them could quite define. "Order whatever you want," Kieran said as they slid into the booth. "Food's simple, but it's good." Francesca glanced at the menu and then back at him. "Let me guess, regulars here know you by name." Kieran smirked. "Perks of living in a small town." She studied him, her expression unreadable. "It must be nice, having a place where you belong." Kieran frowned. "You don't." Francesca hesitated, then shook her head. "Not really." Something in her voice made Kieran wonder just how complicated her life was. But before he could ask, the waitress arrived, and the moment passed. As the night stretched on, their conversation flowed effortlessly. Francesca was sharp, witty, and surprisingly down-to-earth for someone who looked like she belonged in a penthouse. And Kieran, well, he had no business being this comfortable around her. When they finally left the diner, Kieran had almost forgotten about her car. "I'll get your tire fixed first thing in the morning," he said, unlocking the truck. "I can drop you off somewhere if you need." Francesca hesitated. "Actually, would you mind showing me around town?" Kieran blinked. "You want a tour?" She shrugged. "I've spent my whole life in cities. I wouldn't mind seeing what I've been missing." Something about the way she said it made Kieran's pulse pick up. "All right," he said, trying to sound unaffected. "Let's go." As they drove through the quiet streets, Francesca rolled down the window, letting the cool night air sweep through her hair. "You know," she said softly, "this place is kind of beautiful." Kieran glanced at her, and for the first time since they met, he wondered what it would be like if she stayed. But that was ridiculous. Because Francesca, she wasn't meant for a life like his, and he sure as hell wasn't meant for a woman like her. The soft hum of the truck's engine filled the quiet space between them as Kieran drove through the winding roads of his small town. Francesca gazed out the window, her expression unreadable, while the warm glow of streetlights cast fleeting shadows across her face. "This is Main Street," Kieran said, gesturing toward the row of small businesses lining the road. "That bakery over there makes the best cinnamon rolls you'll ever have." Francesca turned to him, amusement flickering in her eyes. "Big claim." He shrugged, keeping his eyes on the road. "Try one in the morning and you'll see I'm right." She didn't argue, but her lips curved slightly, as if she was filing away the thought for later. A few minutes later, Kieran pulled into an empty lot overlooking the lake at the edge of town. The water shimmered under the moonlight, perfectly still, reflecting the stars above. Francesca stepped out of the truck, wrapping her arms around herself as she took in the view. "It's beautiful." Kieran leaned against the hood, watching her. "Best place to think." A breeze lifted strands of her dark hair, and she tucked them behind her ear absent-mindedly. "You come here often, when things get overwhelming." "It helps." She was quiet for a long moment. Then, in a voice softer than before, she said, "I don't think I've ever had a place like this." Kieran studied her carefully. There was something about the way she said it, like someone who had always been running, never stopping long enough to let herself belong anywhere. "What do you do, Francesca?" She hesitated, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. "Business," she finally said. He raised a brow. "What kind of business?" A small, almost conflicted smile played on her lips, the kind that never lets you sleep. Kieran could tell she was holding back, but he didn't press. He had no reason to. She was just passing through. Whatever secrets she carried weren't his to uncover. Instead, he gestured toward the lake. "You ever skip rocks?" Her brows knitted together. "Can't say I have." He pushed off the truck and crouched near the shoreline, sifting through the smooth stones. After selecting one, he turned back to her. "Watch." With a flick of his wrist, the rock skimmed across the water 4 times before sinking. Francesca looked impressed. "That was surprisingly graceful," he chuckled. "Your turn." She took a stone from his hand, mimicking his stance. When she threw it, the rock plopped into the water immediately, sending up a weak ripple. Kieran bit back a grin. "Not bad." She shot him a look. "That was terrible." He picked up another stone and placed it in her palm, his fingers brushing hers. "Try again." "This time, flick your wrist, don't just throw it." Francesca exhaled, concentrating. This time, the rock bounced once before sinking. She turned to him, triumph lighting up her face. "Did you see that?" Kieran nodded. "One bounce. Not bad for a beginner." She laughed, and for the first time since they'd met, it was completely unguarded. For a moment, Kieran forgot she wasn't from here, that she wasn't someone he could see again after tonight. He forced himself to step back, shoving his hands in his pockets. "We should get you somewhere for the night. Only motel in town isn't much, but it's clean." Francesca hesitated. Then, before he could turn away, she said, "Actually." "Could I meet your daughter?" The question caught him off guard. Kieran frowned. "Why?" Her expression softened. "Because the way you talk about her, it's rare." "I'd just like to say hello." Something inside him wavered. He never brought strangers home, especially not ones who belonged to a different world. But there was something about Francesca, something he couldn't quite explain. Finally, he nodded. "All right." The drive back to his place was quiet but not uncomfortable. When they pulled up in front of his small house, Francesca looked around, taking in the modest home with a thoughtful expression. "You can wait here if you want," Kieran offered. But she shook her head. "I'd like to come in." He hesitated, then led the way inside. The house was small but warm, filled with signs of a child's presence, crayon drawings pinned to the fridge, a small pink backpack resting by the door. Kieran walked to Lily's room, pushing the door open carefully. She was fast asleep, her dark curls spilling over the pillow. Francesca stepped inside quietly, crouching beside the bed. She studied the little girl's peaceful face for a long moment, something unreadable passing through her eyes. "She's beautiful," she whispered. Kieran's throat tightened. "Yeah. She is." Francesca reached out, brushing a stray curl from Lily's forehead before standing. She turned to Kieran, her expression unreadable. "She's lucky to have you." He didn't know why, but the words felt heavier coming from her. A long silence stretched between them before she finally exhaled. "I should go." Kieran nodded, leading her back to the truck. As he drove her to the motel, something gnawed at him, something he didn't want to admit. He didn't want this night to end. But Francesca, she wasn't meant for a life like his, and come morning, she'd be gone. Kieran woke to the sound of knocking. For a moment, he thought he was dreaming, but then it came again, a firm, deliberate rapping against his front door. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, rubbing his face before checking the time. It was just past 7 in the morning. Still groggy, he padded down the hall and pulled the door open, blinking against the early morning light. Standing on his porch, holding a paper bag and 2 cups of coffee, was Francesca. "Morning." She lifted the bag slightly. "I brought breakfast." Kieran frowned, still trying to process the sight of her standing there, looking far too comfortable for someone who was supposed to be passing through town. "You didn't have to do that," he said, stepping aside to let her in. "I know," Francesca replied, breezing past him into the kitchen. "But I wanted to." Kieran shut the door and followed her, watching as she set the bag on the counter and pulled out 2 cinnamon rolls from the bakery he'd mentioned the night before. "You remembered," he said. Francesca tore off a piece of the pastry and popped it into her mouth. "I figured I should see if they lived up to the hype. And," she finished chewing before answering, "not bad." Kieran shook his head with a quiet laugh, grabbing the second coffee she'd brought. "So what are you still doing here?" Francesca hesitated, something flickering in her expression. "My car isn't fixed yet." He leaned against the counter, studying her. "That's not the real reason." She sighed, placing the cinnamon roll down. "Maybe not." Kieran waited, giving her space to say whatever was on her mind. "I called my assistant this morning," she admitted. "Told her I'd be delayed." He raised an eyebrow. "Why?" Francesca met his gaze. "Because I needed a break." Kieran wasn't sure what to say to that. He had assumed she was someone who thrived on control, on order. The idea that she had willingly stepped away from whatever high-powered life she led just to linger here felt unexpected. Before he could respond, light footsteps padded into the kitchen. Lily appeared, still in her pajamas, rubbing her sleepy eyes. When she spotted Francesca, she stopped, tilting her head slightly. Francesca crouched down to her level. "Good morning, Lily." Lily blinked at her, then looked at Kieran for confirmation. "She's a friend," Kieran assured his daughter. Lily considered this for a moment before nodding. "Okay," Francesca smiled. "I brought cinnamon rolls. Want one?" Lily glanced at Kieran again, and when he gave a small nod, she moved forward, taking the pastry from Francesca's outstretched hand. As Lily sat at the table, Francesca leaned closer to Kieran and whispered, "She's cautious." Kieran nodded. "She's had to be." Francesca studied him, as if trying to read between the lines of what he wasn't saying. A comfortable silence settled over the kitchen as they ate. It was strange, Kieran thought, how natural it felt, Francesca sitting at his table sipping coffee, making small talk with Lily. But it couldn't last. Once breakfast was done, Kieran stood. "I should get your car taken care of." Francesca set her cup down. "Can I come with you?" He hesitated. "To the shop," she nodded. "I'd like to see where you work." Kieran wasn't sure why she was so interested, but he didn't argue. A short drive later, they pulled up to the small auto shop where Kieran spent most of his days. The familiar scent of motor oil and rubber greeted them as he led her inside. The place was modest, nothing fancy, just a large garage with a few bays, tools lined up on the walls, and a small waiting area near the front. Francesca wandered, taking everything in. "You run this place," Kieran shook his head. "Work here. The owner's a good guy, lets me bring Lily when I need to." She nodded, touching a wrench on the workbench. You're good with your hands. Kieran glanced up from where he was pulling a tire from the storage area. Kind of have to be in this line of work. Francesca watched him as he moved, something thoughtful in her gaze. You like it? Kieran considered the question. It's honest work. Pays the bills. She leaned against the counter, crossing her arms. What would you do if money wasn't an issue? Kieran paused, caught off guard by the question. I don't know, he admitted. Never had the luxury of thinking about that. Francesca nodded, as if she understood. He shook his head. What about you? What do you do that keeps you so busy? For the first time, Francesca hesitated. Then, slowly, she said, I run a company. Kieran raised an eyebrow. What kind of company? She exhaled. $1 billion investment firm. Kieran froze, the wrench in his hand feeling suddenly heavier. He looked at her, waiting for the punchline, but there wasn't one. Francesca held his gaze, unflinching. You're serious? She nodded. Kieran set the wrench down. So what, you're some kind of billionaire? Something like that. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to process. She had seemed well off, sure. But this, Kieran let out a dry laugh. Guess I should have asked for more than coffee. Francesca smiled. Probably. He shook his head, still trying to wrap his mind around it. Why didn't you say anything? She shrugged. Would it have changed anything? Kieran thought about it, and the truth was no. She was still the same woman who had stood by the lake with him last night, who had brought breakfast this morning, who had patiently earned Lily's trust. But it also changed everything. Because whatever had been forming between them, whatever quiet possibility had lingered in the air, it didn't belong in the same world as hers. Kieran exhaled, forcing himself to focus on the tire in front of him. I should get your car finished. Francesca watched him, and for the first time since they met, she looked uncertain. Kieran, he cut her off gently. Francesca, you don't belong here. The words hung between them, heavy and undeniable. She didn't argue, but she didn't leave either. Kieran tightened the last bolt on Francesca's tire, his hands working with mechanical precision while his mind wrestled with everything she had just revealed. A billionaire. The woman standing a few feet away from him, watching him with quiet intensity, was from a world so far removed from his own that it felt almost absurd to think they had spent the last day together like two people with no differences between them. And yet, despite knowing the truth, despite every logical part of him screaming that she was just passing through, he couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't ready to leave. Francesca shifted slightly, her fingers brushing against the dusty countertop of the auto shop. You're upset. Kieran exhaled, wiping his hands on a rag before finally turning to face her. I'm not upset, just trying to figure out why someone like you is still here. For a long moment, she didn't reply. Then with a quiet certainty, she said, because I don't want to leave. The words settled between them, thick with meaning. Kieran's jaw tensed. Francesca, she shook her head. I know what you're going to say, that this doesn't make sense, that we live in different worlds. Her voice softened, something raw underneath. But what if I don't want to go back to mine? Kieran stared at her, his pulse thrumming. You're telling me you'd walk away from all of it. The billion-dollar company, the high-rise offices, the life you built. Francesca held his gaze, something unshakable in her expression. For the first time in years, I feel like I can breathe. And it has nothing to do with money or power, it has to do with you. His chest tightened. This wasn't supposed to happen. She was supposed to be a fleeting moment, a strange, beautiful encounter that ended as quickly as it began. But now she was standing there, offering him something he hadn't even let himself consider. A future. Kieran ran a hand through his hair, his voice rougher than before. Francesca, I have a daughter. My life isn't some fantasy where you can drop everything and stay. She stepped closer, her presence overwhelming in the best kind of way. I don't want a fantasy, I want something real. And real means complicated. It means figuring things out even when they don't make sense. Kieran's heart pounded. He wanted to believe her, wanted to let himself have this. But reality wasn't that simple. Then, as if sensing his hesitation, Francesca reached for his hand, her fingers threading through his. "You told me Lily is your whole world," she murmured. "I want to be part of that world if you'll let me." Kieran swallowed hard, his resolve crumbling. He had spent so long believing that love, real love, wasn't something meant for him. That his life was already set in stone, built around responsibility, not reckless emotions. But Francesca wasn't reckless. She was steady even in her uncertainty, fearless in a way that made him want to be fearless too. Before he could overthink it, before doubt could creep back in, he pulled her closer, his hands settling on her waist. Francesca's breath hitched, her eyes searching his. And then, finally, he kissed her. It wasn't tentative or uncertain. It was everything he had been holding back, everything he had tried to convince himself wasn't possible. Francesca melted into him, her arms wrapping around his neck as she deepened the kiss, as if she had been waiting for this just as long as he had. When they finally broke apart, Kieran rested his forehead against hers, his voice low. "God help me, but I don't want you to leave either." Francesca smiled, something radiant and unguarded. "Then don't let me," he exhaled, nodding once as if sealing something unspoken between them. And just like that, the world he thought was out of reach became something he could finally hold. Kieran had never been the kind of man to believe in fate, but as Francesca stood in front of him, her expression open and certain, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, some things were meant to happen. Still, reality had a way of creeping in. The day after their kiss, life settled into a strange in-between. Francesca stayed in town longer than expected, and though neither of them spoke about it, it was clear she wasn't in any rush to leave. She spent her mornings at the auto shop with him, pretending to be interested in engine repairs when Kieran knew she was really there just to be near him. In the afternoons, she wandered the town, stopping by the small cafe on Main Street or taking walks down by the lake. And in the evenings, she found herself at Kieran's house, sitting at the kitchen table with Lily, helping her with puzzles or reading to her before bed. It was too easy, too natural. And that terrified him. One evening, as they sat on his porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Kieran finally voiced the thought that had been gnawing at him. "This can't last forever," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Francesca turned her head, studying him. "Why not?" Kieran exhaled, resting his forearms on his knees. "Because this isn't your life," she frowned, setting her drink down beside her. "And what if I want it to be?" He shook his head. "Francesca, you don't belong in a town like this. You have a company to run, a life waiting for you." She was silent for a long moment, then shifted closer. "What if I don't want that life anymore?" Kieran turned to her, his chest tightening. "You don't mean that." Francesca held his gaze, something unshakable in her expression. "I do. Before I came here, my life was nothing but boardrooms, deals, and endless meetings. I was always chasing something, more success, more power, more control. But for what? I don't even know anymore." She paused, her voice softening. "But here, with you and Lily, I feel like I've finally stopped running." Kieran clenched his jaw, torn between wanting to believe her and knowing how impossible it was. "You don't just walk away from a billion-dollar company," he said, forcing himself to be practical. "And even if you did, are you really ready for this? For a life where money doesn't solve everything, where things are hard sometimes." Francesca let out a quiet laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Kieran, do you think money has ever made my life easier?" He frowned, caught off guard by the question. She continued, her voice steady. "I've spent my entire life surrounded by wealth, but I've never had what you and Lily have. A home that feels like more than just walls. People who care about each other, not because of what they can gain, but because they choose to. I may have more money than I know what to do with, but I've never had this." She gestured between them. "And I don't want to lose it." Kieran swallowed hard, his pulse pounding. He wanted to believe her, wanted to let himself hope, but hope had never been kind to him before. Francesca reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "Don't push me away because you think it's what I need. Let me decide what I want." Kieran stared at her, his throat tight. Then finally, he exhaled and squeezed her hand. "All right," he said, his voice rough. "But if you're staying, you need to be sure." Francesca smiled, something radiant and unguarded. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." Days passed, and slowly, something new settled between them, a quiet certainty that neither of them had felt before. Francesca didn't leave. Instead, she started making calls, delegating responsibilities at her company, setting things in motion for a life that no longer revolved around power and boardrooms. Kieran watched it all happen with a mix of admiration and disbelief. And then, one evening, she walked into the auto shop with an envelope in her hand. "I did it," she said, holding it out to him. Kieran wiped his hands on a rag before taking it, his brow furrowing as he opened it. His eyes scanned the document and his stomach tightened. "You're stepping down." It wasn't a question. Francesca nodded. "Not completely. I still own the company, but I've appointed a new CEO. Someone who actually wants the job." Kieran let out a slow breath, his head spinning. "You really did it," she smiled, stepping closer. "I told you I choose this." "I choose you." Kieran set the envelope down and pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. She melted into him, her arms wrapping around his waist as if she had always belonged there. And maybe, just maybe, she did. The weeks that followed were filled with quiet moments that felt more real than anything Kieran had ever known. Mornings spent making breakfast together, Francesca laughing as she tried, and failed, to flip pancakes without making a mess. Afternoons at the lake, where Lily made her teach her how to skip rocks, refusing to let her quit until she got at least 3 bounces. Evenings on the porch, where Kieran would wrap an arm around her and just be. It wasn't grand or extravagant, but it was theirs. And then, one night, as they sat under the stars, Francesca turned to him, something unreadable in her gaze. "I want to build something here," she said softly. Kieran raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, then reached for his hand. "A home, a life, with you and Lily." Kieran's chest tightened. He had spent so long believing that happiness like this wasn't meant for him. But Francesca had walked into his life, torn down every wall he had built, and shown him that maybe, just maybe, he was worthy of something more. Slowly, he brought her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "Then let's build it together." Francesca's smile was the kind that could light up the entire world. And for the first time in his life, Kieran let himself believe that this was only the beginning. The town's annual summer festival arrived with a quiet kind of certainty, the way traditions always did. It was the kind of event that brought everyone together, where neighbors exchanged stories over homemade pies and children ran through the streets with sticky hands from too much cotton candy. Kieran hadn't planned on going. Crowds weren't his thing, but when Francesca had turned to him that morning, excitement lighting up her face, he knew there was no saying no. Lily had been the final push, looking up at him with wide eyes as she insisted they had to attend because Francesca had never been before. And now, here they were, walking through the bustling streets, the scent of caramel popcorn and fried dough filling the air. Francesca took it all in, her gaze flickering from the colorful string lights to the booths lined with handmade crafts. "This is incredible," she said, her voice filled with something close to wonder. Kieran chuckled, watching as Lily tugged her toward a stand filled with small glass bottles of homemade honey. "Didn't take you for the small-town festival type." Francesca glanced at him over her shoulder, amusement dancing in her eyes. "Turns out I like a lot of things I never gave a chance before." Kieran didn't miss the way she looked at him when she said it, and something in his chest tightened. They spent the evening weaving through stalls, Francesca insisting on trying every kind of food she hadn't before: fried pickles, kettle corn, even a funnel cake that she ended up covering Lily's nose with powdered sugar from. Kieran just watched, his heart doing something unexpected every time Francesca laughed, every time she leaned in like she belonged here. And maybe, he thought, she did. As the sun dipped lower, They found themselves near the edge of the festival, where an old wooden dance floor had been set up beneath strings of twinkling lights. A local band played slow, easy music, couples swaying together in time with the melody. Francesca turned to Kieran, her expression teasing. "Dance with me." Kieran hesitated. "I don't dance." She tilted her head, considering. "I don't believe that." Lily, ever the instigator, tugged at his hand. "Daddy, you have to." "It's the rules." Kieran sighed, running a hand over the back of his neck. He wasn't the kind of man who did things like this, who made a spectacle of himself in front of an entire town. But then Francesca reached for his hand, her fingers warm against his, and suddenly, the idea didn't seem so bad. With a resigned exhale, he let her lead him onto the dance floor. The music was slow, the kind that made time feel like it stretched endlessly. Francesca stepped in close, resting a hand against his shoulder as he settled his palm against the small of her back. They moved in easy rhythm, swaying more than actually dancing, but neither of them seemed to care. Francesca looked up at him, her voice softer now. "I think I've fallen in love with this town." Kieran swallowed, his throat tight. "Yeah," she nodded, "but only because of the people in it." He knew what she meant. Knew exactly what she wasn't saying. His fingers tightened slightly on her waist, and he leaned in, not caring that they were surrounded by half the town, not caring that this was the kind of thing he would have once avoided at all costs. When he kissed her, it was slow, deliberate, and entirely too perfect. The music faded, the voices around them blurred, and for a moment it was just them. When they finally pulled apart, Francesca let out a breathless laugh. "I think that was breaking another one of your rules," Kieran smirked. "Guess I'll have to make some new ones." The festival continued around them, but Kieran didn't pay attention to any of it. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking about what came next. He wasn't worried about how things would work or whether this was a mistake. For the first time, he just let himself be happy. And for once, happiness didn't feel like something just out of reach. It felt like something he could hold.